author of a book that just dropped last week about the city of Atlanta's professional sports called Loserville. And before you take umbrage with that, I'm going to introduce Clayton here, but tell us right off the bat where the title Loserville and give us the full title of your book.
Well, thanks for having me. My name is Clayton Trutor. My book is called Loserville: How Professional Sports Remade Atlanta and How Atlanta Remade Professional Sports. The title Loserville comes from a column by Lewis Grizzard in July 1975. At the time, he was the editor of the Atlanta Constitution, and they ran a two-part series about the futility of Atlanta's pro sports teams during the 1960s and 1970s. In 1965, Atlanta had no major pro sports whatsoever. By 1972, they have teams in the four major pro sports leagues. Over time, the honeymoon of these teams got shorter and shorter, and Grizzard is writing about how these teams were both struggling on the field and also struggling at the box office. My book essentially is about Atlanta's pursuit of pro sports in the 1960s, the arrival of these teams, and the difficulties they face, often unexpected difficulties they face during the 1960s, 70s, and beyond. In a broader sense, this book is an origin story for the modern sports business. It shows how expansion cities became major league cities like Atlanta by going out, rolling out the red carpet, making public investments in pro sports, and convincing the major leagues to expand or relocate franchises to their city. The problem Atlanta faced, as well as a number of other expansion cities like San Diego or Tampa or Jacksonville or New Orleans, is that you had people from a lot of parts of the country coming to these places. You had local populations that already had existing sporting interests. Many of these cities, like Atlanta, were very spread out, and it proved a tougher sell than people expected, particularly for cities like Atlanta that got a lot of teams at the same time. So that's the broader idea of my book.
Yeah, I mean, you go way back, and I guess the Atlanta Braves, which moved from Milwaukee, were the first franchise, I believe, and it's interesting to me because what happened. Of course, on that team was Hank Aaron, who probably is the most well-known athlete from Atlanta. Grew up in Mobile, Alabama. Was obviously played as an incredible baseball player, and his tied to Atlanta and all things Atlanta sports. Take us back and sort of talk about how the Atlanta Braves came to Atlanta, how the Braves came to Atlanta, and specifically sort of the political and the what it took for the city and the business leaders and to bring the Braves here, because that's a super interesting part of your book.
Thank you. It really starts with the election of Ivan Allen as mayor in the fall of 1961. He takes over from William Hartsfield, who'd been very focused on growing Atlanta as an economic hub for the region. He hadn't been particularly interested in pro sports, though. Ivan Allen, among other things, when he's running for mayor, has a major plank in his platform called Major League City. He says if Atlanta wants to be regarded as one of the country's significant major cities alongside Los Angeles or New York or Chicago or Detroit, it needs the amenities that those cities have, which included pro sports. So he pushed for the construction of a multi-purpose stadium as well as a multi-purpose arena. Those eventually end up being Atlanta Fulton County Stadium and the Omni Coliseum. In terms of luring the Braves, Atlanta had been making this push from the time of Allen's election. For a couple of years, there really isn't a lot of progress. All of a sudden, a guy named Charlie Finley, who was the owner of the Kansas City Athletics, is disgruntled with what's happening in Kansas City with his franchise. He meets Furman Bisher, who's the sports editor of the Journal, and Bisher takes him for a tour of Atlanta, and Finley helps him pick out a site which becomes the site of Atlanta Fulton County Stadium. Atlanta gets the momentum of building a stadium going, but Finley does not get American League approval to put a franchise in, to move his franchise to Atlanta. Finley was a curmudgeonly character who had made a lot of enemies, and the league didn't want to reward him for his behavior by letting him move to Atlanta, which is not only an eager marketplace, but also a very lucrative one. It was the media center of a 7-state region that had no pro sports whatsoever. So it was a great market to move into, and they didn't want to waste it on Finley. So the Braves end up going to the All-Star game, or not the Braves, the Atlanta city leadership, Allen, the leader of the Stadium Authority, other city leaders end up going to the All-Star game in Cleveland in 1963. They meet the owners of the Milwaukee Braves, who are suddenly disgruntled in town. There had been a group of basically young, wealthy industrialists who buy the team in '62, based in Chicago. They try to do a stock sale similar to Wisconsin's other pro sports franchise at the time, the Green Bay Packers, sell some of the franchise to their fans. They saw this as a way to get their money back. They'd initially invested in the Milwaukee Braves franchise. The people in Wisconsin see it for the cash grab that it is. They buy like 15,000 out of a 120,000 stocks. And from that moment on, the Braves are looking for a new home. They encounter this group from Atlanta that's very eager to build a stadium, to get Major League. They sign a deal. Atlanta starts building a stadium. The Braves agree to move to town. There's a protracted legal battle between Milwaukee County and Atlanta for control of the franchise. In April 1966, the Braves arrive in Atlanta.
Well, do you see this one of the if not the first, but certainly one of the more important crossovers of business, politics, and sports? Of course, baseball has been around for almost 200 years and is intertwined with owners making money, but it just seems like bringing Atlanta leaders saw this as a chance to sort of put Atlanta bigger on the map and saw that sports was important to that, Major League sports, and also the public investment in it. And it clearly has been that way since then, and to this day, that politics, business, and sports are all intertwined.
Without question. There'd certainly been franchises that relocated before this, the Dodgers and the Giants to the West Coast. There'd been cities that offered public money for stadiums before. There'd never been a city that so explicitly went out and said, we want to be Major League, we're willing to make investments, that went out and hustled essentially to become a Major League town. Atlanta did this, and many other cities have followed their path in terms of doing this. The idea that the public leaders would be the people out there selling their city to become a Major League community is something Atlanta essentially invents. And by wishing not only to get the Braves, but to get all the major leagues and make Atlanta this hub of pro sports, dozens of other cities literally have followed Atlanta's path and course into the major leagues, adopting this very model to try to get teams from the NHL, NBA, MLB, and National Football League.
And why was Atlanta particularly, or what are your thoughts on why Atlanta might have been particularly well suited to be sort of the first major league city or the biggest major league city in the Deep South at this time? I mean, you're talking about the early 60s, which is a pretty much a tumultuous time for, American social and politics going on.
I mean, for a couple of reasons. First of all, it's the region's economic hub by that period. It's outstripped Birmingham or Charlotte or other places as being the banking and insurance center of the region by that time. It's also a major transportation hub. More significantly, though, Atlanta was by far the most progressive city in the South. It was a city that was desegregating on its own without court orders forcing it to act in certain ways by desegregating lunch counters or public accommodations in downtown Atlanta. While the rest of Georgia was certainly not on the same page as Atlanta. Atlanta had taken this very progressive step, had a biracial governing coalition since the late 1940s, which included the white business community, the prominent black business community in the city, and the white professional class were essentially the ruling class in the city, and black voters provided a huge part of the electorate that would get first William Hartsfield and then Ivan Allen elected mayor. So if you're a northern corporation, Atlanta is by far the least embarrassing southern city from that perspective in with which to do business, because things weren't perfect, but they certainly made a lot more progress than all of their peers. And they very, very openly spoke about, the leaders in town very openly spoke about how they were willing to build coalitions, make deals, willing to move forward. So Atlanta's progressivism is what made it the city that got pro sports in the region.
To go from what it was 64, 65, 66, where there are no pro teams in Atlanta to just 30 years later, and Atlanta is hosting the Olympics is pretty remarkable if you think about it. I found one little tidbit that was pretty interesting. I grew up a Braves fan. That was my first love of any sport. I grew up in South Carolina. The Braves were on TBS, and all of this is a crossroads of Ted Turner taking over the Braves, and sort of they were the lovable losers at that point. With at one point Ted Turner taking over managerial positions for the Braves, but One of the things that jumped out at me is talking about sort of the placement of actual Atlanta Fulton County Stadium and just sort of the history of that. Many of these baseball stadiums, some of the more classic ones were in neighborhoods and, crammed in there and sort of took a little bit of the character of the neighborhoods around them. But Atlanta was just this, this round bowl in the middle of, basically an interstate construction zone. Tell us a little bit about that. And also specifically, it was interesting, the complaints were about, there wasn't anything around it, restaurants. And at that time, it felt like it was far out from downtown, which is something we kind of heard of when the Braves moved to Truist Park in Cobb County.
Yeah, in terms of the location, it was originally a neighborhood. And in the late 1950s, as the city of Atlanta was engaging in federally subsidized urban renewal, they bulldozed the neighborhood over. And the idea was that there would be affordable housing that would replace it. Once stadium talk came up, the Atlanta Housing Authority ends up selling that piece of property to the Stadium Authority for a relatively affordable price in the time period. So affordable housing went out the window in that particular space in the name of the stadium. Really, at the first moment that Charlie Finley snapped his fingers and said, let's put a stadium there, the city leaders moved from being very much in favor of putting affordable housing in the location to supporting putting a stadium in that location. Later on, Allen does make progress on that issue. His successors, Sam Massell, Maynard Jackson, end up being much better on that matter. But it is certainly a setback in affordable housing in a piece of land that where tens of thousands of people had once resided. It had been it's certainly not a wealthy neighborhood, but a fairly stable neighborhood too. So it's a very, very difficult situation, and looking back, certainly something that's quite unfortunate.
Yeah, I mean, you hear these arguments all over the place for, when they built Mercedes downtown and the people that would be moved. And, and you look at a franchise like the Washington football team Commanders, I guess I almost called them by their old name, and they moved from RFK downtown to their own stadium out in the middle of nowhere. And it's all about money and the politics that are involved. So if you're a sports fan, it's hard to get away from all these things. So going back and reading this book, especially for younger folks that are in Atlanta, that go back and read this book, because you're going to learn a lot about what what you hear about now is was going on back in the day, as they say. And certainly the older folks that tune in, surely you can learn. And I mean, some of this stuff I read about it, I'd heard and understood a little bit of it, but how far and how deep and just how intertwined with Atlanta sports this is, it's pretty interesting. Okay, so you've talked about how the Braves came to town, and then the Hawks, and then for short-lived while the Flames, share some of the more interesting sports stories. My favorite one I'm going to lead is about how important and how much a factor wrestling actually is. And anybody that's a sports fan in around Atlanta probably is a wrestling fan, or certainly has watched wrestling.
Well, I spent a lot of time in my youth watching wrestling too, so I certainly count myself among that legion. Wrestling in my book is part of a broader story about a lot of times when people talk about the trouble that Atlanta has as a pro sports town, or did historically, was, well, it's full of transplants. They aren't connected to the local teams. I also make the argument that Atlantans didn't start being interested in sports just when they got Major League. They'd been decades of extensive support of a wide range of sports and participatory activities outdoors, as well as indoors, long before the big leagues got to town. Certainly college football with UGA and Georgia Tech were both incredibly big. High school football, stock car racing, it was frequently drawing 100,000 spectators to it. Not to mention dozens of dirt tracks around the state that were drawing 5, 6, 7, 10,000 people on a regular basis. Golf, boating, tennis, a wide range of activities that were particularly popular in Atlanta suburbs. If you want to go play tennis, go play golf. Going back into the stands on an August night and sweating it out at Atlanta Fulton County Stadium may not have been the most attractive thing. Professional wrestling, in particular, I talk a lot about in the book, had such a large and rabid audience, not only on television but also just a live audience. And for the most part, in the 60s and 70s, there were occasionally shows at the Omni. But in the 60s and 70s, most of the shows were at the city auditorium, which was known colloquially as the Armory. It had been an armory in the city dating back to the Cleveland administration, and very frequently there would be standing room only crowds of 5,000 people hooting and hollering and going crazy watching pro wrestling there. Well, just a mile away at the Omni, there were 3,200 people kind of passively watching pro basketball in beautiful movie theater style seats, watching Pete Maravich play for the Hawks, who is probably the best known basketball player in the country. So simply because you have a beautiful new arena, you have the most popular basketball player in the country playing there, doesn't mean you're going to give up on your existing sporting passions. So people remained deeply committed to the things that had interested them beforehand. Just because there were guys with Atlanta across their chest didn't mean people were going to give up on what was previously interesting to them. The interesting thing about the Hawks also during Maravich's era is in 2 of the 4 years he's in town, the Hawks are the best drawing road team in the entire NBA because people want to go see Pete. They'd heard about Pete Maravich at LSU. Anytime they played outside of the Deep South, they got these tremendously huge crowds of people who just heard all about Pete Maravich and wanted to see him. So wherever the Hawks went, Maravich, the people, they drew incredibly well. And people on the road at home would chant, shoot, 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 the minute he got the ball because they wanted to see Pete Maravich throw it up or do crazy ball handling or no-look passes and all the kind of things, the kind of Showtime game he had. But people in Atlanta got very quickly blasé about Maravich, and they were one of the worst drawing teams in the league for much of his time period.
Yeah, it's kind of hard to think about, you getting a chance to see Pete Maravich. It seems like a no-brainer now, but just, sign of the times, it just didn't happen and didn't, some say, certainly I've heard people say Atlanta is not an NBA town. I disagree. I think Atlanta has shown, especially last year during the Eastern Conference Finals, exactly what kind of fan and that, it's an NBA fan Atlanta can draw. So it's pretty interesting to hear that history. And of course, Dominique Wilkins is probably the first Atlanta Hawks player I can remember. Pete Maravich was a little bit before my time. But yeah, people may take umbrage with Loserville, and especially knowing that it comes from Georgia's own Lewis Grizzard, makes that a little easier to take. But yeah, we were the lovable losers until, I guess our first championship was not the Atlanta Braves in 1995. You actually, I had never heard of the Atlanta Chiefs before your book. So tell people that don't know about the Atlanta Chiefs, because that was yet another major league team that Atlanta had that did not have before their mid-60s.
Atlanta had a previous and fairly successful crack at pro soccer when the NASL comes in the late 60s. Essentially, it comes in as a pro sports league in response to the television popularity of the 1966 World Cup. A lot of Americans cheered on England winning the World Cup at home, drew very good television audiences on ABC Wide World of Sports. So a bunch of wealthy sports guys were sitting around looking for the next football, which had become such a big television attraction in the 1960s. A lot of people thought soccer was going to be it, including the owners of the Atlanta Braves thought this, and they invested in this new league, got a team whom they named the Chiefs to go along with the Atlanta Braves, and they were early on one of the most successful teams in the league. Their average attendance was well under 10,000, but within the context of their league, that was pretty good, a sport that was very unfamiliar to people all over the country. They had a guy named Phil Woosnam, who was their coach, who did a very good job recruiting a bunch of European players to come play for the Chiefs. In their second season, 1968, they win the league championship, the first pro sports championship in the city of Atlanta. In many ways, the problem with this franchise is because they were so successful and Woosnam was known to be such a good general manager and coach, the league makes him their commissioner. So they poach him out of Atlanta, and it's the league as a whole eventually sinks after a number of years of very difficult financial situations, a lot of franchise relocations. The Chiefs hang around until the mid-70s. They end up moving around where they play. Initially, they played at Atlanta Stadium along with the Braves and the Falcons. But by the mid-70s, they go out of business. But they're actually one of the longer tenured and more successful pro soccer teams in that league. I would say the most significant legacy of the Chiefs, though, is creating a culture of amateur soccer in suburban Atlanta. When they arrive in town, there were 200 amateur soccer players in metropolitan Atlanta. Within 3 years, there's 25,000. And ever onward, there's abundant amateur soccer available in suburban Atlanta. There was a big audience of people waiting who were ready to have something to focus on. Earlier on in the indoor soccer league, the Atlanta Attack drew quite well for several years, late 80s, early 90s. When the United come in, there's certainly a mass audience of people who've been interested in soccer for decades who are ready to support a major league soccer team. and the team succeeded on the field and has certainly succeeded in the stands as well. So I think it's a fantastic long-term Atlanta success story, the story of pro soccer in the city.
Yeah, the fact you referred to it as Atlanta Stadium, and I never knew it was anything other than Atlanta Fulton County, and that is another interesting part of your book. You talked about sort of like exactly how all the political forces came together to make the Atlanta Fulton County Stadium happen, and it was renamed. It was actually Atlanta Stadium for more than just a couple of years.
Yeah, I think the first 8 years it was that, and I think Fulton County, they were paying for it. They wanted their name on it, so eventually they got it that as part of the title.
Okay, so last little segment here before we wrap it up, and I think it's an interesting point. You talk about Atlanta just sort of had a bunch of business leaders, did not have any pro teams, so people that made these teams happen for the city weren't sports people. They were business and political leaders. Specifically, Rankin Smith, I think you shed a lot of light on exactly. I mean, and I think Loserville probably it would still applies to Atlanta to some degree. But I would think that most Atlanta fans see them as the most feudal franchise, having come close a couple of times to a Super Bowl, but never getting over that hump. And of course, the famous 28-3 Patriots comeback. So, talk about sort of, the Atlanta sports owners and sort of the problems of what you see in your research on the city of Atlanta sports.
The first generation of Atlanta sports owners tend to be either novice owners or absentee owners. In the case of the Braves, they were largely in Chicago. Bill Bartholomew was really the face of them, was the managing general partner and various other titles at different times. But a lot of those guys were still in Chicago. So you had people who weren't really that invested in Atlanta specifically, who were a lot of the early owners of that team. Turner eventually comes in and you have local ownership that's deeply committed to the city, that is using its broader promotional guile to finally get people in the door, as well as to watch it on television. In the case of the Falcons with Rankin Smith, I interviewed a number of players, and they generally liked the Smith family. They got along well with them. They thought they were very easy to deal with owners, friendly, pleasant people. But they were insurance people. They weren't football people. And early in their tenure, they tended to rely on a lot of people who were their close associates to play prominent roles in the organization. This was not uncommon, though. A lot of other NFL expansion teams or relocated teams with new owners ended up relying on people who were great at whatever business they came from, but were not specifically adept in that the business of their particular sport. In the case of the Hawks and Flames, you have Tom Cousins, who's a real estate developer, and this is his business. When he buys the Hawks, he explicitly said, the only player in the NBA I knew when I bought the team was Wilt Chamberlain. And you have, I mean, to a great extent with those franchises, you have people running them who are not particular experts on the sport. In the case of the Flames, though, one thing that worked well was they had a GM named Cliff Fletcher, who had been the assistant GM for the Montreal Canadiens. And the on-ice product, at least of the Flames, was very good during their time in town, making the playoffs on 6 of 8 occasions, in large part because Fletcher was able to very much build a particular culture of his team, a defense-oriented club that ended up succeeding. But in a broader sense, all of the clubs dealt with having essentially novice ownership, and other expansion cities face this too. I would say one of the lessons of the book is rely on people who are experts in your sport to run these organizations, and certainly that's happened in Atlanta over time. Turner, when he takes over the Braves and Hawks, it takes him a while to figure this out, but certainly in the case of the Braves, when John Schuerholz takes over as GM, you couldn't have a better guy running the operation, and the Braves have really been the premier organization in baseball for the past 30 years. The Hawks certainly got better over time too, and by the late 80s were a great draw and a well-run team as well, and they got various, Hubie Brown, Mike Fratello, many fine coaches came in and ran that team. In the case of the Falcons, once the Arthur Blank organization comes in, this is a very corporate professional organization, brings a lot of people who have a lot of football expertise in, and they have success, they have failures, but in many ways they're being run the other way, the way the other teams in the league are being run. It's not an outlier mom and pop kind of operation as it tended to be in its early years. So having people in place who put in experts in these fields has proven to be very important for the success of teams, not only in Atlanta, but across these expansion cities in the South and West.
Do you see, based on what you researched, to to do your book, the growth of Atlanta professional sports as a cautionary tale, or is someone that could, read this and just how prophetic it was about the way that future of sports was going to be handled at the professional level? What would you glean about going forward? What might a reader glean going forward after reading your book?
It's interesting. A lot of people who've had nice things to say about the book have called it a cautionary tale. I don't really think of it in that way so much. To me, it's more the story of a group of people trying something that nobody had ever really tried before. There'd never been a group of city leaders that had made this attempt before. So to me, it's there's a lot of disappointments from the book, but I kind of look at it maybe a little bit from a distance because I'm certainly not from the region. I picked this city because it was most emblematic of what was happening with the changing nature of pro sports in America in the later part of the 20th century. I look on with admiration for the guile they showed, their willingness to build their city up, promote it to the world. I mean, I think Atlanta is as good at promoting itself to the rest of the world as any city that I can ever think of. I first at this national stage in the 60s, with the 90s, with getting the Olympics, it's taking that same model, that same approach, and bringing it to the international stage. So I look at it as a story of admiration, a story of unintended consequences. Yeah, I don't really see it as a cautionary tale, although a number of people who've read it have perceived it that way.
I think cautionary might be couched in the sense that, a lot of people don't like their politics and sports or, intertwined, and the nature of what it takes to pull off a major league franchise of any sport. It requires a lot of hands working together. So, maybe cautionary is not the right word, but certainly this is what it looks like for a modern franchises. And I think, it is, like you say, it's been a good roadmap for some of the other cities that have, expanded into major league sports.
Well, I would say one lesson of the book that I take quite seriously is the idea: if you want a pro sports team, get them because you want to watch that particular sport. If you want to get a pro hockey team, get them because lots of people want to watch hockey, or lots of people want to watch basketball, or whatever sport it is. Don't get them because you see it as a source of civic unity, as a source of prestige, because it will fall short oftentimes of your expectations of this. And I think for Atlanta city leaders, it didn't turn out quite as they had anticipated. And I think they felt disappointment, whether they would say so or not, felt a degree of disappointment about the way things turned out in their early years, because they expected these teams to be out of the box successes, a tie that binds the city together. You'd see a lot of language how pro sports will be the axis or the center of gravity for Atlanta. And I just don't know that it became that, at least in its early years. And I think it's tough for that to be the case in any city, particularly a place with a lot of transplants, a place that's very spread out. And I think an important part of the transplant story is it's not simply transplants from the north, because that's what people think about, but Atlanta is such a hub for people from across the south because there's so many economic opportunities in the city. So you have people coming from near and far who end up making Atlanta their home temporarily or in the long term.
I think
yeah.
That's an interesting point, because that's the SEC, especially the SEC football world is centered in Atlanta, with the SEC championship that's been held here since '92, or I don't think it was actually held here for a couple of years after that. It was Birmingham was the first time. But it is interesting because, that's not one team, that's 14 teams, but yet you can go to any bar, any restaurant, and find a fan of those teams, because it's college football has been around a lot longer. It's a lot more organic in terms of how the fans are, but Atlanta is a hub to that. And I can remember I was working in Boston, or actually working with some people from Boston and Rhode Island, and they sort of kind of make fun of the Atlanta fans at that point. This was when the Braves, were towards the end of their run in the 90s and early 2000s. And, one of the good sports fans said that, hey, look, you can knock them for not, going at 2:00, round one of the postseason, but go to a football game on between Athens or Knoxville or Auburn or go to a NASCAR race, just like you've talked about. I mean, they're Atlanta and Southern sports fans are real. It just took a long time to buy in on some of these pro franchises, and maybe to some degree of why they came here. They, business people putting together a product to sell maybe wasn't exactly what fans exactly wanted from their sports. Having watched football on Friday nights, like you talked about, Sunday, as you say in the book, Sunday was the third day of football for most Atlanta fans.
Well, one thing that's interesting to me from personal experience, a lot of people I've met who are Northerners who've moved down to Atlanta is the degree to which they've embraced regional passions. People who would have never, in my wildest dreams, I would have thought of as people who'd watch stock car racing, suddenly watch stock car racing when they're moving to suburban Atlanta or Charlotte. They're into boating, they're into golf, activities they wouldn't have previously been involved with. I think simply by living in the region, a lot of people adopt certain aspects of the culture, but simply by being there. In terms of the appeal of the SEC and football in the region, I think one thing that's quite telling is that in 1966, when the Braves arrived, both the Journal and the Constitution have a beat writer for every single SEC and ACC team. So the Journal and Constitution were both employing a Wake Forest football beat writer during this time period. I mean, it can't be understated the significance of this. In 1969, when the Braves play in the NLCS, the first ever NLCS, the two Braves home games against the Mets were the fourth and fifth best drawing sporting events that weekend in the region. The number one drawing event was the UGA football game. I think they were playing Clemson. Number two, it was a non-conference game at that point. Number two was Georgia Tech's home game. Number three was the Falcons game, which was played at Georgia Tech because of the baseball playoffs going on. But because Johnny Unitas was coming to town for the first time, they got a standing room only crowd for that. So yeah, baseball was fourth and fifth, even on its premiere weekend, arguably in Atlanta before Aaron's home run chase.
Georgia Tech Stadium being filled up with people that want to watch the away team. Never heard of that before. All right, Clayton, thank you very much for joining us. All right, so tell everyone where you can get the book. It is called Loserville, and I'm going to let you tell us the full name and where you can get it.
Sure. My name is Clayton Trutor. My book is called Loserville, How Professional Sports Remade Atlanta and How Atlanta Remade Professional Sports. It's published by the University of Nebraska Press. It's available on their website as well as Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and all the well-known online book retailers. You can check me out on Twitter at Clayton Trutor, ClaytonTrutor.
I think what we should do maybe is have you on a Spaces with me and Graham one night, if you would hang out with us and maybe take some questions from some folks after they watch that. So we'll try to make that happen. Thank you for joining us, Clayton. Check it out, Loserville. It's a must read for any Atlanta sports fan. Sort of know it's the origin story. You watch all your origin story movies. This is definitely feels like an origin story for a lot of the successes that we're experiencing as Atlanta fans. But it came from a lot of pain and suffering as you and just a lot for it to happen. So Clayton, thank you again.
Oh, thanks so much. This was a lot of fun.